Hello everyone. For our last lecture of the course, we're going to go through an area of, or particularly a use of machine learning that we've only alluded to in the past couple lectures, and that is how to use machine learning in a way that you can interpret its results and be able to use that to make informed decisions or improve your understanding of the data that was used to train it. And this is an area of machine learning that, depending on who you talk to, is either of ancillary benefit, that the real predictive power of machine learning is the ability to create models that are too complex for humans to have come up with, or as kind of captured by this out of context quote from Nick Wagner and James Rondinelli from Northwestern, that interpretability is indeed a requirement of being able to perform machine learning. And there's a lot of kind of good justification for this. The first of which is machine learning models that are not interpretable have a great risk of making predictions based on, say, non-causal factors or just ancillary biases in the data that lead to something that a model that won't generalize well. That is, say, learned behaviors due to biases in the data that aren't necessarily based on an actual mechanism. And you can see that in this example here, this is an example of a machine learning model that we can go back and interpret, and it can give us some rather reasonable explanations for why it characterized this picture of allegedly a dog playing the guitar is, as the machine learning model claims, an image of an electric, an acoustic guitar, and a Labrador. And we can see that the regions of the image are actually corresponding to what you would expect as a human should be driving those decisions. And of course, as we've alluded to in one of the very early lectures of this class, there are many kinds of image-based machine learning that pick up on factors that are not explanatory, such as the machine learning model for identifying where the road in an image is, picking up on bands of green corresponding to grass on the edge of the image to define the boundaries, which can, of course, cause problems in generalization when you drive on a bridge. Another example of a good reason to use interpretable machine learning is that the machine learning models themselves might pick up aspects of the data that you didn't expect initially. So for example, this paper from 2018 illustrates how they trained an interpretable machine learning model, interpretable in the sense that it has features in it that can correlate to kind of expected physics of this problem and be able to narrow down not only kind of what exactly is going on in this model that is designed to distinguish between metals and non-metals, but further be able to give some indication on why some of these materials sit on the boundary than others. And that is, if we look at one of the terms here, the volume of the cell, if that increases, you're more likely to go to non-metallic. And that can tell you something about, if the volume of the cell, I got a division mixed up. For if you compress the cell, so the volume of the cell goes down, the likelihood of being non-metallic goes up, and this tells you why some materials will exhibit a transition between metallic and non-metallic under compression. Alright, so moving on from there, the area that I wanted to go into in a bit more detail today as a lecture is defining some kind of rules of thumb on what you need to do to ensure you can create a machine learning model that is interpretable. And there's no magic recipe for this, but the way that I view it, you can break down the kind of approaches you could use for building a model that is ultimately interpretable into a few different categories. And we're going to go through each of these in a bit more detail through the next couple slides. So the first of which is to start by using features that have some meaning that you can correlate with physical effects. Now, a great example of this is work from Kong and others back from 2012, where they were trying to train machine learning models that could tell you, given the composition of a crystal, how likely it is to form different structures. And the way that they started off this problem is to go back to the theories that had been able to make these kind of predictions for simpler types of crystal classes. For example, there was pioneering work in the 80s from Pierre Villers that illustrated how tools like the difference in electronegativities or the difference in sizes of an atom, as expressed by the difference in their pseudopotential radii, can predict which structures will form given, say, different sizes or bonding strengths between atoms. And the idea behind this goes back even further to Pauling's rules that illustrate if size mismatches are within a certain range, different coordination structures are about to form. Say if atoms are about the same size, they'll form a coordination number of 6, which gives kind of cubic arrangements in a crystal. Now, they also use some other terms like Miedema model, which is from an established theory that describes the strength of bonding between two different elements at different compositions. And together, these form not only some quantitative features that can be used to predict a machine learning model, or to be able to use to establish a predictive machine learning model, but because they are tied to meanings beforehand, allow you to make reasoning about the model after it's trained, and hopefully make an assumption that the meanings that these models or these features have are preserved in the way the machine learning model uses them. And this you can see reasonably in this case of a set of decision rules that were created to predict which elements would form in this aluminum diboride structure if you put gadolinium on the one of the two sites. And these rules are kind of reasonable based on our understanding of crystal formation. I can see that if the pseudopotential radii difference at delta R exists within a certain range, only then am I likely to form this crystal structure, which is again reasonable based on those Pauling's rules that we just mentioned, where I know that size differences define coordination environments that are stable, which can therefore define which ways or which structures are stable. And I can look at these and say, hey, this is a good set of rules. I may not understand all of them, but I can look at a few of them and say, all right, this is picking up on physics that I would have expected to be true. Now, another reason this was possible is that Kong and others used a machine learning technique that produced interpretable models, and is illustrated by this table on the left, which came out of a real excellent textbook, Elements of Statistical Learning. Different machine learning models lend themselves to interpretations better than others. You can take Mars, which is a linear regression-esque technique, produces models that have small numbers of features that are each kind of associated with a linear factor. So I can see, does this feature lead to an improvement of the property or a decrease? And that lets me reason about the physics. And in the case of that example of crystal structure prediction, the way that they achieved an interpretable model was sticking with a decision tree that was simple enough to be determined or to be assessed by a human later. Now, an important note here is that just assuming a different or selecting a certain kind of machine learning model doesn't guarantee that the resultant output is going to be interpretable. So if I take a look at support vector machines, which in this table are kind of rightfully labeled as the less interpretable kinds of machine learning models, especially for high dimensions, their model forms aren't really kind of accessible to the human mind. But whereas if I have a low dimensional space, I can visualize them very well, and I can see that in this example from the scikit-learn documentation, I can separate these three different kinds of iris flowers by the sizes and aspect ratios of their petals. And that, to me, I can check, all right, I can interpret this. This model seems reasonable based on what I would have expected, given what I know about plants. And I can also take a interpretable machine learning model like a decision tree and adjust its settings such that it produces a model kind of too complex for me as a human to make a lot of headway about. I would either kind of fail in being able to interpret all of the nuances, or create kind of natural language explanations of it that just don't do the model enough justice to be able to trust it. So again, there's no silver bullet for making an interpretable machine learning algorithm, but you can pick methods that will produce a model form that is interpretable, and you can choose settings that preserve that interpretability. The other kind of rule of thumb for how to go about making a machine learning model is making sure that you have trained it in a way that your interpretations are resistant to noise. Now, in an ideal picture, there could be, of all the models you test, only one that fits the data superbly. And regardless of whether you take individual points out of it or add noise to the data to simulate the uncertainty in the data collection, that picture is never going to change. But what happens more often, especially with small data sets of those that are kind of small enough to be well described by simple models, this kind of degree of certainty about which model form is the best doesn't always hold. So what you have to do is repeat the experiment multiple times under different conditions, say different random seeds for the learning algorithm, such that with the same data it will produce different results, or changing your data set in some way that ensures that your explanations are robust to small changes in the data. And if this is something that kind of rings a lot of bells to you and is something you want to try, I highly recommend reading this paper I identify on the bottom that shows not only how to use linear regression models and interpret them, but also does a really great job of ensuring that their predictions are reasonable under the effect of the uncertainty in their data. Alright, so moving forward, the last kind of tool you can use in building a machine learning model that's interpretable is breaking data from large data sets that contain many diverse kinds of entries into simpler ones that are more amenable to being kind of explained with a model that's simple enough to be studied by a human. Now, a good example of this is work from Bryce Meredith and Chris Wolverton from 2014, where they illustrate how, when trying to understand how different elements can be dissolved within zirconia, if one treats the entire periodic table with a single machine learning model, you can create decent kinds of machine learning approaches. Here you can show that, say, the radius of that atom must be around 0.9 to be kind of dissolvable with a very low solution energy, or that the dopant D-band center has to be within a certain range again to achieve that desired dopant level. That these kind of global models don't really do an adequate job. Their correlation coefficients are rather low. Now, the way that Bryce and Chris approached this was to first take all of their elements and use a technique from machine learning known as clustering, where I take all of my materials and recognize which ones are most similar to each other, and you can see satisfyingly that they line up with elements on the periodic table. You can see that early and late transition metals are determined to be different from each other, and by breaking the data into these different groups and fitting a different model to each of those groups, you can achieve better fits that can illustrate how different regions of your data might be described by different physics. So now that we've talked about kind of at a very high level what are some ways that you want to approach building an interpretable machine learning model, I will spend the next couple of minutes in this lecture talking about the kind of techniques that one can use in practice to create models that are legible to humans. Now, the first of which to consider is sparse linear regression. So linear regression can be described as a loss function with two parts. And you can see that up on the top left. So I've got this y minus alpha x term, which y is my input training data that I'm trying to predict, x are my input features, and alpha are the parameters to my models. And this notation here is called the L2 norm, and what that describes is a sum of the squares over all of those differences between actual and predicted values. So I've got that one error term, but I also have this regularization term that comes at the end, where I'm adding in some level defined by lambda of this term alpha, or this LP norm of those model parameters alpha. So you can see here what happens with this kind of regularization term at the end is that we're adding some error to the model that's dependent on the size of the parameters. Now, the interesting part about this so-called LP norm is that by varying the P I choose between, say, 0 and 2 or 2 and 4, I can change how my error signal or my penalty is affected by small changes in my parameters. And we'll look at 3 of those possible choices to get some examples. So if I pick 2, this is known as ridge regression, and this has an analytical solution. I can solve this with linear algebra, and the interesting effect that it has is shown by the picture on the left, the brown line, that small increases in my parameter from 0 lead to very small penalties. And what this means is that there's very little penalty for adding in a non-zero term into my model, so I often get machine learning models that have many parameters in them. So this is not great for interpretability, but I can solve it very quickly. Another route I can do is use a technique called lasso, where instead of using the L2 norm, I set p equal to 1, which means my error is just the sum of all of my coefficients. Now what this does, as illustrated on the left, means that adding in or increasing my parameter alpha 0 from 0 to some small value has a larger penalty. And what this means is that as I train my model, my optimal solution may end up having many terms like alpha 0 that have a value of 0, just due to this nature of even small increments of that parameter leading into a penalty. And this here is a little more difficult to solve. It doesn't have an analytic solution like the L2 based ridge regression, but in the words of an optimization problem, it's convex, which means you can create very good solvers for it that say I pick one random guess and I can follow gradient descent. In effect, they're more clever techniques to be able to identify what my optimum solution is that minimizes my loss function. And kind of the final term that's very important is the L0 norm. Now, it may not be directly apparent from this model form, but what the L0 norm gives you is a penalty equal to 1 regardless of the value of a parameter, as long as it's non-zero. If it's 0, it doesn't affect the norm. Even if it's, say, 1 times 10 to the negative 10, it has a penalty of 1. And what this means is there's a very large, I didn't finish typing here, a very large penalty for adding in small parameters to the model. Now this leads to very sparse models in the effect of there's kind of a benefit to choosing a model form that has the smallest number of parameters as possible, but this is neither analytically solvable nor a convex optimization problem, which lends itself to these kind of gradient descent-like solvers that are at least moderate in their computational costs. So what you end up having to do is use global optimization or heuristic-based techniques, which can be very slow. So if you want to train one of these models, you can get something that's very simple. It's got a lot of non-zero got a lot of terms that are set to 0 that you can ignore when understanding the physics, but there's a large cost to being able to train one. But this is something that kind of has a lot of benefits behind it. There's a great series of work out of a group in Berlin that has shown how you can use some heuristic solvers to this L0 optimization to be able to create those kind of simple models that we showed in our second slide that allow you to be able to interpret why a machine or why materials would be metallic or non-metallic, and even be able to make some explanations on why the metallicity of a material changes with pressure, again based on the volume of that cell. And this technique, because it's so good at being able to identify these sparse models, what they do is they take their features, and as illustrated in these equations on the x and y axis, take their features and combine them to form these little nonlinear forms that let you come up with very complicated models that have only a few terms in them. Now, another way you could go about this is a technique called genetic programming, where I can express my functional form as a kind of a tree form, and this is something that I can manipulate. I can say take two trees, take a branch off one, graft it onto another, and that gives me the ability to use genetic algorithms, as we used in one of our homeworks, to be able to find some optimal formula that describes a model or not. And this is not exactly L0 based regression, but it's similar in spirit in that it produces very succinct model forms that lend themselves to interpretation. Another area that I alluded to back in the beginning of our lecture is one of the ingredients for a understandable machine learning model is to train a complex model, but then devise some means of being able to interpret why it's making individual predictions. And there are many different ways of doing this, and one of which is called LIME. I think it's local interpretable models. And this this picture, I'll note that I pulled from a really wonderful web textbook called Interpretable Machine Learning that goes into many of these techniques. But we'll just describe LIME for once because it gives a kind of a very exemplar case of how one can do this. So here, imagine I start with a model like the picture on the left, where I'm distinguishing between these gray and blue classes. And once I have that model, I'll take an individual prediction, like the one I highlight in yellow. I'll then make many variations of the input features for that prediction and weigh the ones that are nearby my target prediction more, and train a simple machine learning model that, if I evaluate each of those nearby variations, and I predict what is the outcome of my machine learning model for each of them, I can come up with a very simple model form. Like on the right here, I can show that, well, if I decrease feature 1, that'll cause me to switch from the gray to blue class in this particular region. And I devised this by just making a bunch of predictions with my machine learning model, and then training a very simpler form. Here, this could be something like a support vector machine that has a simple enough model form for me to be able to understand. And the reason it could be so simple is I'm not trying to explain all of the data. I'm just trying to explain a single prediction. And another kind of cool example of how you can use LIME is you can do this with images, where, say, I break up an image using clustering techniques, where I identify kind of large groups of pixels that are similar. And then I use this LIME technique. I make predictions with my model as I permute the values of these different pixels. And that can allow me to train a machine learning model that tells me, as I change each of these different groups of pixels, what effect does it have on the outcome. And I can see that, well, these pictures on the left, or these pixels on the left that cover a dog, have a negative effect in this picture, kind of classifying as a cat. But the ones that highlight the cat on the right have a positive effect. So including those pixels explains my kind of classification as a cat. And this is something taken from the GitHub that provides a Python toolkit to use LIME in your own research. So my kind of take-home points from this lecture will be to kind of highlight a few different kind of rules of thumb to keep in mind as you're trying to create a machine learning model that is interpretable. You're going to want to start with simple features that already have some meaning you can associate with them. Use a simple model form, something that produces a model that you can then kind of read as a human. Keep your data set small enough that a simple model can be sufficient to describe them, and then perhaps use some ablation test where, say, I eliminate features as we did in that Lyme example, and use local models to, say, describe what those differences are. And these again are kind of useful if you're using more complex sets of models. Some things to watch out for is ensure that you have those simple features ahead of time that have kind of known physics behind them, so you limit the amount of after the fact reasoning you do. Keep your machine learning models simple so that your explanations of them are kind of equal in complexity to the model that's actually being used. And then keep in mind that the correlation between these features and your output may not be associated with the physical effects that you think it might be. So consider of some experimental tests you could use to be able to assess whether your model is actually based on the causal features you believe it to be, and especially make sure that those predictions account for the effective uncertainty within your training data. And hopefully these kind of general thoughts and specific examples of techniques you can use kind of will give you guys a roadmap to being able to use interpretable machine learning in your own research.